Surah 9, Ayah 29, which is just a few verses down, talks about the Christians and says, "O ye who are people of the book, make war on the people of the book until they pay the zakat and do the salat, the prayers." So you can see that there's an awful lot of violence that comes much later. In Surah 16, Ayah 101, in Surah 2, Ayah 106, you have what we call the law of abrogation, which stipulates that that which we give something better. So if there's two verses that contradict each other, you always go with the latter verse. If there's a Meccan verse that is contradicted by a Medinan verse, you always go with the Medinan verses. So if you have any peace verses that may exist, there's very few of them that exist in Meccan surahs, any Medinan verses obviously abrogate that. So Surah 2, Ayah 256, we have found over 101 verses that abrogate it, including Surah 9:5. Now, Muslims aren't telling you this unless you're talking to men like Sheikh Umar Bakri or Anjam Chowdhury or some of the more radical Muslims in Britain. They're the ones that are coming up with these verses, and they're the ones that are saying, listen, you've got to exegete the scriptures correctly. When you exegete them correctly, you always go with the latter verse. The latter verse is the most authoritative. And the same thing works with scripture. They take that same idea and say, therefore, if there's any contradiction between two scriptures, including the New Testament, you always go with the latter. So therefore, if the Quran contradicts the New Testament on the crucifixion of Jesus, you always go with Surah 4, 157, rather than the four Gospels, using the same paradigm. Can you understand then why it's so important to them that they do exegete it correctly? Now, can you then understand that this is a good discussion for you to get into as Christians? We need to ask and say, hold on a minute. Is that how we look at literature? Is that how we look at historical perspective? Is that how we live today? I mean, when you have an accident out in the street, who do you go to? Second, third, and fourth witness, or you go to the eyewitness itself? No. You don't go to the second, third, fourth witness or someone who's heard it through the oral grapevine. You go to the person who was right there on the scene. That's why we have the signs always whenever an accident happens, asking people who are eyewitnesses to phone up the police. And the same thing actually works within Islam. And we'll get into that when we talk about isnad later on. So certainly these are perfectly good themes for you to talk on when you talk about the universal qualities. Is it universal? Is it relevant for today, especially vis-a-vis these sword verses? Over 101 sword verses that we can count there in the Medinan surahs. Collation. We don't have too much time to get into that one today. Basically, just as a quick overview, when you want to know how the Quran was put together, most Muslims are not aware. Let me just back that up. Most Muslims have not read the Quran themselves. Certainly those living in the West have not read it. For one very good reason. You do not read the Quran like we read the Bible. We have Bible studies. Any of us can open it up in any language, any of our mother tongues, and we can pretty well understand it. You've already said that you had a hard time understanding this book. And that's it's understandable. A good 20% of the Quran nobody can understand. Not even the Islamic scholars can understand a good 20% of it. It just does not make any sense. But you don't go to the Quran, therefore, to understand it. If you are going to read the Quran, you're going to do it to memorize it. So when they say that they have read the Quran, what they're saying is they've memorized the Quran, and almost invariably in Arabic. But remember, only 17% of the world understands Arabic. The vast majority of Muslims you come across, certainly in Europe, do not read or understand Arabic. Though they may have memorized it in Arabic, they will not know what they've memorized. I have a good friend in London. His name is Ishmael. He is a Hafiz. That means he's memorized the entire Quran by heart. And I ask him, just as a game, I say, okay, come on. Ishmael, tell me Surah 2, Ayah 145. And he stops and thinks a while, and then goes, perfect. Exactly word for word. I say, okay, now tell me what you've just said. Oh, Mr. Smith, don't ask me to translate. I have no idea what I've said. This man has memorized the entire Quran, about the size of our New Testament, and he may understand a few words of it, but he has no idea what he's memorized. It's as if I'd asked any of you to memorize the entire New Testament in Greek. Would you do so? Why? What's the purpose? Well, obviously the purpose is to gain barakah, to gain blessing, to that angel that's on their right shoulder, that's recording all their good deeds here. Enormous amount of barakah when you have memorized. And of course you become highly respected in your community. You usually are given the privilege of leading the prayers if you are a hafiz. But nothing more. So they do not go to their Quran to read it, to understand it. You may know more about the Quran just from this session here than what they will when you get out. Now be aware of that. So many times they will question what you're saying, and that's why it's very important that if you do take a Quran, make sure it's in English or in Italian, wherever you're living, so that you can point to it and say, listen, I'm not making this up. It is actually there. Read it for yourself. And you'll probably be doing them a great favor. They need to realize what their Quran is saying. Most of them have no idea what the Quran is saying. There's a huge ignorance. And the same way concerns how it was put together. They have no idea how it was put together. So what I usually tell my Muslim friends is to go back and read how Bukhari tells it was put together. Now, Bukhari is a compiler. Bukhari was a character who lived in the 9th century, who compiled the Quran, who compiled what we know as the Hadith, the most authoritative compilations of part of the Islamic traditions called the Hadith, the sayings of the Prophet. He is considered to be the highest authority after the Quran. After the Quran comes the Hadith. And we'll talk about the Hadith and the Sirah and the Tafsir and the Tariq in a short while. But the Hadith compiled by Bukhari are to be trusted. There is no error, according to Muslims today, there is no error in Bukhari, except if you're Shiite. The Shiites do not like Bukhari. But the Sunnis, who make up 90% of the Muslim world, look to Bukhari as the authority. And the reason why is that since the Quran does not make any sense, since there's not much in the Quran that actually helps you to live today, you need to go to the Hadith to find out how you're to live. All right? You need to go to the Sirah to find out how Muhammad lived. You need to go to the Tafsir, which would be the commentaries, to know how to interpret the Quran. And you need to go to the Tahriq, which would be the histories, to understand the history behind the Quran and how it was put together. But certainly, it's Bukhari that you go to find out how the Quran was collated. And when you go to Bukhari, you find some very disturbing material. Now, in order for you to know what Bukhari says, you need to go up on the internet. All of Bukhari's volumes are up there. You can pull them down. Northampton University, Cambridge University, any of the larger universities in Britain have the ISOCs, the Islamic societies, have put up Bukhari there. However, recently, since we've been getting into this debate, I've noticed that a lot of the Muslims are now pulling out these problem passages, such as Bukhari, Volume 6. Probably the best one to go to is Bukhari, Volume 6, Hadith number 509 and 510. Go and read what it says. And he says, I'll just paraphrase it here. Basically what Bukhari says is when Muhammad died, the Quran had not been written down, but it had been memorized by many of the companions. It had been written down on pieces of bone, stone, sometimes bark. So that Zayd ibn Thabit, who is the scribe, the secretary of Muhammad, was given the responsibility by Abu Bakr, the first caliph, around 632 to 634, to compile it, to write the first recension of the Quran, which he did by going here, there, and yon, getting it from the different numbers of the companions, those who had not been killed at the Battle of Yamama. That first recension then, which is the Quran, supposedly the perfect Quran, was then given to one of the wives of Muhammad named Hafsa. She put it under her bed and left it there for about 20 years. Roughly 20 years later, around 650, let's put up a timeline so you can see where I'm going. Around 650 then, okay, so this happened right around this time. He died in 632, so around this period is the first recension. That is with Abu Bakr, the first caliph. Around this time period, 650 then, Uthman, the third caliph, was approached by Hudayfa. Hudayfa says, listen, what are we going to do? Because there are different recensions, there are different recitations of the Quran. We need to do something about this. We need to write it so people know what is the correct recitation. So Uthman then has Zayd ibn Thabit, who is from Medina, the secretary of Muhammad, along with 3 other men, Alas, Zubair, and Harith, the 4 of them, take Hafsa's copy, which is laying under the bed, took her copy and rewrote it. Now stop and think. Why would you need to rewrite something that's perfect? All right. Beyond that, it says that Uthman championed the 4 of them and said, if you have any problem, if you have any doubt as to what you're to rewrite, now stop and think. Why would they have any doubt if it's perfect and complete? Then you are to take it and you are to go to the Qurayshi dialect and rewrite that which is in the Qurayshi dialect. Now, right away, you can see there are going to be problems because in order to have a dialect, help me out here, Peter. How is it that you delineate one dialect in a written Arabic text from another dialect?
Well, it's difficult because they're mainly vowels.
Exactly. So therefore, you have to have vowelizations to know that one dialect is different. Were there any vowelizations in the 7th century? You got a problem here. How is it that they could even delineate certainly one dialect from another dialect? But you got to remember who's stating this. This is Bukhari telling us this. Bukhari died in 870. This is the 9th century Bukhari who's telling us that this must have been happening in the 7th century. He didn't know his own history. You can see there's some real problems what he's saying here. And the reason why is because if you're going to have